Ranger's growl rolled low across the frozen yard, while snow whipped through Bitter Creek Valley. Walter tightened his grip on the flashlight and stared at the old well buried behind the farmhouse. The chain around the steel cover was newer than everything else on the property. Then, the dog suddenly backed away from the darkness beneath it, like he heard something moving underground. What do you think Ranger sensed first? The snow started before sunset and never really stopped. By midnight, the truck stop outside Twin Falls looked buried alive. Wind pushed white powder across the parking lot in long waves, hissing against rusted trailers and diesel pumps glowing under pale yellow lights. Walter Hayes sat inside his old Chevy Silverado, with both hands wrapped around a paper cup that had gone cold an hour earlier. The heater barely worked anymore. Neither did he. Ranger slept across the passenger seat, beneath two army blankets. The old German shepherd twitched now and then in his sleep. Gray fur covered his muzzle, one ear folded halfway down from some long-forgotten injury. His breathing sounded slow but steady. Walter checked the side mirror again, then the exits, then the mirror once more. Old habits. He always parked near the edge of the lot. Easier to leave fast if trouble started, easier to see people coming. After 4 years sleeping in parking lots, rest stops, and abandoned pullouts across Idaho and Montana, his brain still mapped danger before comfort. A truck down the row slammed its metal door. Walter flinched instantly. His shoulders tightened before he even realized it. Ranger lifted his head. "It's nothing," Walter muttered. The dog kept watching him anyway. Outside, a snowplow crawled past the highway entrance with flashing amber lights cutting through the storm. Walter stared at them too long. For half a second, the lights became rotor wash. Desert dust, radio static, men shouting over gunfire. His breathing changed. Ranger stood immediately, pushing his head against Walter's chest before the memory could fully drag him under. Walter shut his eyes hard. Not here, not tonight. The dog whined softly and rested one heavy paw on his leg. That usually worked. Most nights, Ranger noticed the signs before Walter did. The shallow breathing, the fixed stare, the silence that came right before the bad memories. Walter scratched behind the dog's ear until his own hands stopped shaking. "You're getting too old for this," he whispered. Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat. The phone rang just after 1 in the morning. Walter stared at it for several seconds before answering. Almost nobody called him anymore. Unknown number, probably spam. Still, he picked up. "Walter Hayes?" The woman's voice sounded tired but professional. "Depends who's asking." "My name is Denise Porter. I'm calling from the county legal records office in Custer County." Walter frowned. "Montana?" "Yes, sir." Snow rattled softly against the truck windows. "There's a property matter connected to your name," she continued. "We've been trying to reach you for over 2 months." Walter leaned back slowly. "You got the wrong guy." "I don't believe so." Walter James Hayes, age 63, former Army Transportation Division. His jaw tightened. "You inherited a property claim outside Bitter Creek Valley." Walter almost laughed. "I inherited debt, you mean?" "No, sir. Land." Silence. Ranger watched him carefully now. "The owner passed away last spring," Denise continued. "According to county records, you're listed as the last surviving contact connected to the estate." Walter rubbed both hands over his face. "I don't know anybody in Bitter Creek. The property belonged to Vernon Pike." The name meant nothing. Denise paused before speaking again. "The land's been sealed for years because of tax disputes and safety violations tied to old mining structures nearby. Legally, the county planned to absorb it next month unless a claimant appeared." Walter stared through the windshield toward the storm. So why call me? There's an old transfer clause in the deed. You can claim ownership for $100. That finally made him laugh. A dry, tired sound. $100 farm. I understand how it sounds. No, Walter said quietly. You really don't. The woman lowered her voice slightly. Mr. Hayes, winter inspections start in 2 weeks. After that, the structures may be demolished for liability reasons. If you want the land, you need to appear in person. Walter looked around the truck. 2 duffel bags, 1 toolbox, 3 pairs of socks hanging near the dashboard to dry. That was basically his whole life now. How big is the property? He asked. Just under 40 acres. 40 acres. Walter hadn't owned $40 at one point last winter. After the call ended, he sat there for a long time listening to the storm. Ranger climbed slowly into the front seat and rested his chin on Walter's arm. You hear that? Walter said softly. Apparently, we're landowners now. The dog blinked once. By 3 in the morning, the temperature dropped hard. Walter tried sleeping reclined against the door, with his coat zipped to his throat. Ranger curled against his side for warmth. Then the plow came back, metal grinding, hydraulics whining, rotors. Walter's eyes snapped open. Dark mountains, heat, smoke, someone screaming for a medic. His hand jerked toward a rifle that wasn't there anymore. He sucked in air sharply. Ranger barked once, loud, immediate. The dog shoved against him until the truck interior returned, piece by piece. Cold glass, snow, truck stop lights, Idaho, not overseas. Walter covered his face with both hands. His breathing sounded rough in the silence. I'm all right, he lied. Ranger stayed pressed against him anyway. Morning came gray and bitter cold. Walter drove into town after sunrise with less than half a tank of gas. The Silverado rattled badly every time he braked. First stop was the pawn shop. He sold an old hunting knife, a portable radio, and the last decent watch he owned. The clerk barely looked up while counting bills onto the counter. $86. Walter took it without arguing. At the grocery store, he bought canned soup, cheap bread, jerky, and a large bag of dog food. Nothing for himself besides coffee. The cashier smiled at Ranger sitting patiently near the door. Sweet dog. He's smarter than me, Walter replied. That part was probably true. By noon, Walter stood inside the small county office, holding a stack of papers, while an older clerk typed slowly behind thick glasses. You're really taking the place? The man asked. Walter signed the final page. For $100, I figure I can at least freeze somewhere with walls. The clerk didn't smile. He stamped the document carefully. Outside the office window, snow drifted across the empty street. Then the man looked up again. You really planning to sleep out at that farm? Walter paused. Something in the clerk's tone felt off. Not judgment. Concern. Walter folded the papers slowly and slid them into his coat pocket. Why? He asked. The clerk hesitated too long. Then he simply said, most folks around Bitter Creek stopped going near that property years ago. Ranger stood beside Walter's leg, suddenly alert. And somewhere beneath the quiet creak of the old building, Walter felt the first small crack in the numb life he'd been surviving for years. Not hope. Something colder than that. Curiosity. Walter left Twin Falls before sunrise. The Silverado groaned every time the road climbed. Snow covered most of the highway shoulders, and ice shimmered beneath the tires whenever the wind pushed across the asphalt. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the road. Always watching. The farther north they drove, the emptier the world became. Gas stations turned into long stretches of pine forest and frozen hills. Old ranch fences disappeared beneath drifts, nearly waist deep. Walter liked roads like this. Nobody asked questions out here. Nobody looked too hard at an old man living out of a truck with a scarred German shepherd beside him. Around noon, he pulled into a roadside turnout, overlooking a valley buried in snow. Bitter Creek sat below like something forgotten by time. A church steeple, a feed store, a handful of smoke trails rising from chimneys. That was about it. Walter killed the engine and listened to the silence. No traffic, no sirens, just wind moving through the mountains. Ranger suddenly let out a low rumble deep in his chest. Walter followed the dog's stare toward the valley road below. A dark pickup sat parked near a closed gas station. The driver looked up briefly as Walter's truck passed, then looked away too fast. Walter kept driving. By the time they reached the center of town, snow had started falling again. The diner windows glowed warm against the gray afternoon. A few men in heavy coats stood outside the hardware store, talking quietly. Their conversation stopped when Walter pulled in beside the curb. He noticed that too. Veterans noticed everything. Inside the diner, heat and bacon grease wrapped around him instantly. Ranger stayed close beside his leg, while several customers glanced up from coffee cups and pie plates. An older waitress approached slowly. "You passing through?" Walter pulled off his gloves. "Depends. What can I get you?" "Coffee. Whatever's cheap." She nodded toward Ranger. "Dog allowed?" He's calmer than most people. That almost earned a smile. Almost. Walter sat near the window facing the door automatically. Ranger curled beneath the booth, but never fully relaxed. The waitress returned with coffee. "You headed somewhere in this weather?" Walter took a sip. Burnt. Strong. Perfect. "Got property outside town." That caught her attention. "What property?" "The old Pike place." Silence settled fast around the diner. Not loud silence. The kind people pretend not to notice. A man near the counter slowly lowered his newspaper. The waitress looked toward him before speaking again. "You family?" Walter shook his head. "Not that I know of." The woman wiped her hands on her apron nervously. "Haven't seen anybody out there in years." "What happened to the owner?" "Vernon Pike?" She shrugged carefully. "Mostly kept to himself. That usually means there's a story." This time she did smile a little. "In Bitter Creek, there's always a story." Before Walter could ask more, the man with the newspaper stood and walked out without finishing his meal. Ranger watched him leave. The dog's ears stayed raised long after the door shut. An hour later, Walter followed a narrow county road west out of town. Snow swallowed most of the tire tracks ahead. Pine trees crowded close along both sides like walls. The Silverado fishtailed twice before reaching the final turn. Then Walter saw it. The farm sat alone beneath the mountains. Weathered fencing stretched across frozen fields nearly buried in white. A leaning grain shed stood beside a two-story farmhouse with boarded lower windows and a sagging porch roof. The place looked less abandoned than exhausted, like it had been losing a fight with winter for a very long time. Walter parked slowly. The engine ticked as it cooled. Neither he nor Ranger moved at first. Then Ranger climbed down from the truck and stopped dead in the snow. The dog's posture changed instantly. Alert, focused. Walter looked around carefully. Nothing moved. No smoke, no lights, no sound except wind. Still, Ranger stayed stiff beside the truck, staring toward the back side of the property. Walter grabbed his duffel bag and approached the porch. Snow crunched sharply beneath his boots. The front door key barely turned. When it finally opened, stale cold air rolled out carrying dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic underneath. The farmhouse was darker inside than he expected. Furniture still sat where someone left it years earlier. A coat hung near the door. Dishes remained stacked beside the sink, beneath thick dust. Walter moved room to room slowly, not searching, clearing. Another habit he never lost. Ranger ignored most of the house completely. Instead, the dog paced near the rear windows overlooking the old grain shed and a frozen well several yards beyond it. "What is it?" Walter asked quietly. Ranger didn't answer, obviously, but he kept staring. As evening settled over the valley, Walter got the wood stove working after 3 failed attempts and half a bottle of lighter fluid. The heat came slowly. So did the silence. That was the dangerous part. Silence gave old memories room to breathe. Walter sat in a cracked kitchen chair, eating canned soup straight from the pot while Ranger lay near the stove. Outside, snow drifted sideways through the dark. For the first time in months, Walter wasn't sleeping in a parking lot. Still didn't feel much like home. He found himself checking the windows every few minutes, listening, waiting. PTSD taught men strange things. Sometimes your body stayed ready for danger long after danger disappeared, and sometimes danger really did come back. Near midnight, Ranger stood abruptly. The dog walked toward the back door, with a low growl building in his throat. Walter immediately set the bowl down. "What?" Ranger barked once. Sharp. Warning. Walter stepped onto the porch with a flashlight. Cold air sliced through his coat instantly. The farmyard stretched empty beneath moonlight and drifting snow. Then he saw it. Tracks. Fresh tire marks cut through the snow near the far edge of the property road. Walter crouched slowly beside them. Recent. Very recent. The storm should covered them already. His pulse slowed automatically into that old military calm he hated and trusted at the same time. Ranger moved ahead through the snow toward the frozen well behind the grain shed. The dog stopped there and stared down at it. A thick steel cover sat over the old stone opening, locked with chain. Walter frowned. That chain looked newer than anything else on the property. Wind moaned softly across the valley. Ranger's growl deepened. Walter swept the flashlight beam across the snow again. Another set of tracks. Boot prints this time, leading away from the well toward the woods behind the property, then disappearing completely beneath drifting snow. Walter straightened slowly. Somebody had been here, not years ago, recently. Ranger stayed frozen beside the well, staring into darkness beyond the trees, like he could hear something Walter couldn't. Then, for the very first time since they arrived, the old German shepherd bared his teeth and growled low into the mountain night. Walter swept the flashlight toward the tree line again. Nothing moved, just snow drifting between the pines. Still, Ranger refused to back away from the well. His body stayed tense beneath the falling snow, ears forward, eyes locked on the woods beyond the property. Walter looked down at the steel cover again. The chain bothered him. Everything else around the farm looked old enough to collapse. The fences leaned sideways. The grain shed roof sagged under ice. Even the porch steps groaned every time he climbed them. But the chain looked newer, not brand new, just newer than it should been. Walter crouched beside it and brushed snow away with his glove. Fresh scratches marked the metal near the lock. Somebody had opened it before. Recently, the thought sat cold in his stomach. "Come on," he muttered to Ranger. "Not tonight." The dog followed him reluctantly back toward the house, stopping twice to look behind them before finally stepping onto the porch. Walter barely slept. Wind rattled the farmhouse windows until nearly dawn. Every creak inside the walls sounded like footsteps at first. Twice he got up to check outside with the flashlight. Nothing. By morning, the valley looked buried under fresh snow again. Walter fed Ranger first. Always first. The old dog ate slower these days. Age had stiffened his back legs, especially in cold weather. Walter noticed it every morning now, even if he tried pretending not to. After coffee and canned hash warmed over the stove, he drove back into town. The library sat beside the post office in a small brick building that looked older than the highway itself. A faded American flag snapped in the wind outside. Inside smelled like dust, paper, and radiator heat. A woman around 50 looked up from behind the front desk as Walter entered with Ranger beside him. The dog immediately drew attention. "He friendly?" she asked carefully. "More than most people." That earned a small smile. "I'm Claire Bennett," she said. "You must be the man staying out at the Pike place." News traveled fast in small towns. Walter removed his gloves slowly. "That obvious? You bought groceries, fuel, and winter feed yesterday. Around here that counts as public information." Ranger wandered toward the window while Claire studied Walter more carefully. "You really staying there alone?" "That depends how long the roof holds." Her smile faded slightly. "What do you know about Vernon Pike?" Walter asked. Claire hesitated. "That depends what you've already heard." "Not much. That's usually how people around here preferred it." She led him toward a back room stacked with local records and old county maps. Dust floated through weak sunlight near the shelves. Claire pulled out a binder thick with yellowed newspaper clippings. "Bitter Creek used to be bigger," she said quietly. "Mining town. Silver mostly. Some copper. Then the tunnels started collapsing in the late 80s. Walter flipped through photographs of mudslides, damaged roads, and boarded homes. "People died?" "A few officially." Claire crossed her arms. "Depends who you ask, unofficially." Walter looked up. "There was a company involved," she continued. "Bought up land after the mine closures. A lot of families sold cheap because they didn't have options. Vernon Pike didn't? No. Why?" Claire shrugged slightly. "Some said he blamed the mining company for the landslide near Miller's Ridge." Walter paused on a photo showing rescue crews digging through snow and broken timber. "What company?" "Blackstone Mineral Holdings. They dissolved years ago. Convenient. That happens more than you'd think." Walter noticed several empty spaces inside the archive shelf nearby. "Missing files?" Claire sighed softly. "County records disappeared after the mine shut down. Tax records, survey maps, lawsuits." She looked toward him carefully. "You asking because of the well?" Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know about that." Everybody in town knew Vernon kept it locked. Why? No idea. That part sounded honest. Outside, wind pushed snow against the library windows. Claire lowered her voice. "Some folks thought he stored equipment down there. Others said he just didn't trust people." Walter thought about the tire tracks from the night before. "What kind of people?" Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward Ranger. The old dog stood near the entrance now, staring toward the parking lot. Alert again. Walter followed his gaze. A dark pickup rolled slowly past the library windows before continuing down the street. Same truck from yesterday. Maybe. Hard to tell through the snow. "You all right?" Claire asked. Walter realized his shoulders had tightened automatically. "Yeah, lie." By late afternoon, snow clouds thickened again over the valley. Walter drove back toward the farm with a shovel, 2 bags of firewood, and a cheap flashlight from the hardware store. Ranger became restless the closer they got to the property. The dog started whining softly before they even reached the driveway. "I know," Walter muttered. Fresh snow covered most of yesterday's tracks. Most, not all. Walter spotted another partial boot print near the grain shed almost immediately. He stepped out slowly. Ranger moved ahead of him, nose low to the ground. The old dog circled the shed once, then stopped near the rear corner where snow drifted deep against the wall. Then he started digging, hard. Snow flew behind him in sharp bursts. "What you find?" Walter approached carefully. At first he saw nothing except frozen dirt and broken weeds beneath the snow. Then Ranger clawed deeper and exposed something gray beneath the surface. Concrete, flat, smooth. Walter knelt beside it and brushed more snow aside. Not natural, a slab, about 4 feet wide, half buried beneath years of dirt and ice. Ranger barked sharply now and scratched harder at one edge. Walter grabbed the shovel from the truck. 10 minutes later, sweat soaked through his coat despite the freezing air. The slab continued farther underground than he expected. Then the shovel struck metal. Clang. Walter froze. Ranger backed away slightly, but kept staring. Walter cleared more dirt with gloved hands, until a rusted steel ring finally appeared near the center of the concrete. A handle. His heartbeat slowed into that old familiar rhythm again. Focus, assess, breathe. The concrete around the edges looked cracked from age. One side had shifted slightly beneath the frozen ground. Walter gripped the metal ring carefully and pulled. Nothing. Frozen shut. He tried again harder, still nothing. Ranger suddenly turned toward the woods and growled low. Walter looked up fast. Movement. Far beyond the tree line, maybe 50 yards out, a figure. Gone almost instantly between the pines. Walter stood immediately, pulse hammering now. "Hey!" No answer, only wind. Ranger barked furiously toward the trees. Walter took several steps forward before stopping himself. Bad terrain, bad visibility. And he was 63 years old, chasing shadows in deep snow, with a bad knee and an old dog. The figure never reappeared. After several long seconds, Walter slowly turned back toward the slab. Snow drifted across the exposed concrete. The steel ring sat motionless in the fading light, waiting. Then Walter noticed something else. Along the cracked edge beneath the snow, a narrow gap opened just enough for darkness to show underneath. Not a drain, not a root cellar, a hollow space. Cold air drifted faintly upward from below the slab, and somewhere deep under the frozen ground of Bitter Creek Valley. Walter realized there was something hidden beneath the farm. Walter didn't sleep much that night. The wind kept scraping across the farmhouse roof, while the loose vent in the kitchen clicked every few minutes, like metal tapping against metal. Ranger stayed near the front window the entire evening, watching, listening. Twice Walter caught himself checking the old shotgun Vernon Pike had left hanging above the fireplace. It hadn't worked in years by the look of it, but his mind still tracked exits, corners, sightlines. Some habits never left. By morning, the valley sat under another layer of snow. Walter brewed coffee on the stove and stared out toward the grain shed through frosted glass. "You know this is a bad idea," he muttered. Ranger wagged his tail once. That wasn't agreement, just loyalty. An hour later, Walter stood beside the concrete slab again, with a pry bar, flashlight, and rope he'd found in the barn. The steel ring groaned when he pulled this time. Frozen dirt cracked loose around the edges. Then suddenly, the slab shifted several inches with a deep grinding sound. Ranger backed up immediately. Cold air rushed upward stronger now. Damp, mineral heavy. Walter shoved harder until the opening widened enough to reveal darkness below. Not a bunker, not some secret vault. Stairs. Old wooden steps disappearing underground beneath the grain shed. Walter aimed the flashlight downward. The beam caught timber supports, rusted pipes, and wet stone walls disappearing into the earth. A mine access tunnel. "Jesus," he whispered. Ranger whined softly beside him. Walter tied the rope around a support beam anyway. Then he started down. The wood creaked beneath every step. Cold wrapped around him almost instantly. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became until even the wind outside disappeared. Only dripping water remained. Ranger followed carefully behind him. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber about 20 feet below the shed. Thick support beams lined the walls, darkened by moisture and age. Walter swept the flashlight slowly. Old tools, collapsed shelves, rotting crates. A rusted mining cart tipped sideways against the wall. The place smelled like wet dirt, mildew, and old wood soaked for decades underground. Ranger moved ahead cautiously, nails clicking against stone. Walter spotted faded markings painted onto one wall. Tunnel B, East Maintenance Route. So Claire had been right. The farm connected to the old mining system, somehow. Walter stepped farther, inside carefully, testing every section of ground before putting full weight down. Years ago overseas, one bad step could end your life. Turns out mines weren't much different. The farther they moved underground, the more signs of Vernon Pike appeared. Lanterns, folded blankets, canned food long expired. Someone had spent time down here, a lot of time. Walter found the first box near the back wall beneath a tarp. Paperwork, most of it ruined by moisture, but some pages survived. Property maps, letters, old county notices. Ranger suddenly barked once sharply from farther down the tunnel. Walter followed the sound fast. The dog stood beside a narrow passage where water trickled through cracked rock. His ears stayed pinned forward. "What is it?" Then Walter heard it too, creaking, soft, somewhere deeper in the tunnel. He froze instantly. The sound came again. Wood under pressure. Walter killed the flashlight for 1 second and listened. Nothing after that, just dripping water. Still, his pulse had already shifted into that old combat rhythm again. Fast but controlled. Ranger stayed close to his leg now. Walter kept moving. The tunnel narrowed before opening into another chamber, reinforced with thick beams blackened by age. Several metal filing cabinets sat against one wall. One had collapsed open. Walter crouched beside it. Inside were stacks of old letters bundled with twine, many addressed to families around Bitter Creek, some unopened, others marked returned. Walter unfolded one carefully. The paper cracked at the edges. "Mrs. Keller, we are asking all remaining residents near Miller's Ridge to relocate until the investigation into the collapse is completed." He frowned. Another letter mentioned compensation payments. Another referenced evacuation orders before the landslide. Then Walter found names, workers, families, children, pages of them. Ranger began growling low again. Walter looked up fast. The dog stared toward the ceiling beams. Overhead, another creak echoed through the chamber, louder this time. Walter's stomach tightened. The support beams. Water damage had eaten through half the wood above them. "Easy," he whispered. He stepped backward carefully, too late. A loud crack exploded overhead. Ranger lunged instantly. The dog slammed hard into Walter's leg just as one of the beams snapped loose from the ceiling. Walter hit the ground sideways. Timber crashed where he'd been standing less than a second earlier. Dust and dirt burst through the tunnel. Ranger barked furiously. Walter coughed hard, ears ringing. For a moment all he saw was brown dust swirling through flashlight beams and falling debris. Then silence. Heavy silence. Walter pushed himself upright slowly. The collapsed beam blocked half the chamber. Now, Ranger stood beside him, trembling slightly but unharmed. "You stubborn old fool," Walter breathed. The dog pressed against him anyway. Walter checked the remaining supports carefully. Still holding. Barely. They needed to leave now. Walter stuffed several surviving papers into his coat before moving back toward the main tunnel. Ranger stayed close enough to touch the entire way out. The stairs felt steeper climbing back up. The cold daylight outside hit Walter's face like surfacing from underwater. For several seconds he just stood there, breathing hard, beside the grain shed, while snow drifted through the valley around them. Then Ranger barked sharply toward the farmhouse. Walter turned instantly. The front door stood slightly open. He knew he'd shut it before coming outside. Every nerve in his body tightened. Walter grabbed the pry bar and moved carefully through the snow. The porch creaked beneath his boots. Inside, silence. Too quiet. Ranger entered, fresh at first, growling low. The kitchen looked untouched. So did the living room. Then Walter saw the papers. The old property documents he'd left on the table, now scattered across the floor. Drawers hung partially open. Cabinets, too. Whoever came inside hadn't stolen anything. They had searched. Walter moved through the house room by room. Clear left, clear right. Old instincts returning before he could stop them. No intruder remained inside. But near the back door, he noticed wet boot prints melting slowly across the floorboards. Fresh. Ranger sniffed them aggressively, then looked toward Walter. The old dog already understood what Walter was only now admitting to himself. Somebody else knew about the tunnels under Bitter Creek. And somebody had just realized Walter knew too. Walter locked the front door before sunset. Not because the old farmhouse lock would stop anybody determined. Just because doing nothing felt worse. Snow drifted across the valley in long, pale waves, while Ranger paced from window to window inside the house. The old shepherd hadn't settled once since finding the boot prints. Walter understood the feeling. He sat at the kitchen table beneath the weak yellow light and spread out the papers rescued from the tunnel. Most were brittle from moisture, some barely readable, but enough remained to tell a story nobody in Bitter Creek seemed eager to talk about. Evacuation notices, land transfer agreements, compensation forms never signed. One letter mentioned unstable mining supports weeks before the collapse that destroyed part of Miller's Ridge. Another included names crossed out in red pencil. Walter stared at the pages for a long time. Then Ranger growled low toward the driveway. Headlights. A truck rolled slowly through the falling snow before stopping near the porch. Walter stood immediately. His body reacted before his thoughts caught up. Heart faster, breathing shallow, eyes searching hands, movement, exits. The man stepping from the truck looked to be in his late 50s. Heavy coat, expensive boots, calm posture. Too calm. Ranger planted himself between Walter and the front door instantly. The knock came a few seconds later. Walter opened the door halfway. The cold rushed inside. "Mr. Hayes?" Walter nodded once. The man offered a thin smile. "Name's Owen Pike." That got Walter's attention. Pike. Same last name as Vernon. "I own the feed supply store in town," Owen continued. "Figured we should probably meet considering you're living on my family's old property now. Your family sold it, technically." Owen glanced past Walter into the house. "Mind if I come in?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Ranger's growl deepened. Owen noticed the dog and wisely stayed on the porch. "Fair enough," he said quietly. "I'll keep this simple." Snow blew between them under the porch light. Owen reached into his coat and removed an envelope. "There's $20,000 in here." Walter stared at him. "You paid $100 for that farm," Owen said. "I'm offering 200 times that to walk away before winter traps you up here." Walter didn't touch the envelope. "Why?" Owen exhaled through his nose slowly. "Because that property's trouble. That's supposed to scare me?" "No." Owen glanced toward the dark grain shed behind the house. "It's supposed to save you time." Ranger barked sharply. Owen stepped back slightly. "Easy there." The dog's ears stayed pinned forward. Walter folded his arms. You know about the tunnels. A flicker crossed Owen's face. Small, gone fast. Everybody around here knows old mining routes run under half the valley. You know somebody came inside my house today? That silence lasted too long. Then Owen shrugged once. Maybe local kids. Maybe scavengers. Place sat empty for years. Walter kept watching him. Years ago overseas, Walter learned something useful. People lied with their shoulders before they lied with their mouths. Owen Pike was lying now. Not smoothly either. I'm not looking for trouble, Owen said carefully. I just think you'd be smarter taking the money. Walter looked at the envelope again. $20,000. Enough for an apartment. Enough for heat. Enough to stop sleeping in survival mode every night. For a second he imagined it. A quiet room somewhere. Warm walls. No more frozen mornings inside the Chevy. Then Ranger moved closer against his leg. Walter looked down at the old shepherd. Gray around the muzzle now. Slow getting up some mornings. Still loyal anyway. Walter handed the envelope back. I'm staying. Owen's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger exactly, frustration. You dig too deep around here, he said quietly. You're gonna uncover things nobody can fix anymore. Then he turned and walked back toward his truck. Before climbing inside, he stopped. One more thing, he said without facing Walter. Stay out of Tunnel C if you find it. Walter frowned. Owen looked toward the mountain ridge beyond the farm. That section's unstable. The truck disappeared into the snow moments later. Ranger kept growling long after the headlights vanished. Walter closed the door slowly. That conversation left a bad taste in the room, like smoke after a fire. Later that night, the wind strengthened again. The farmhouse creaked constantly. Walter sat beside the fireplace, reading more of Vernon Pike's papers while Ranger slept nearby, or pretended to. The old dog's ears twitched at every sound outside. Walter unfolded another letter carefully. This one wasn't official. Handwritten. The ink had faded badly. Mr. Pike, my husband never came home after the slide. They told us the mountain took him, but folks said the company already knew those supports were unsafe. Walter rubbed tired eyes. Another letter mentioned children relocated after families lost homes near the ridge. Then another, and another, different handwriting. Same fear. Walter leaned back slowly. This wasn't about hidden gold or buried money. It was worse. People had been erased quietly. Their homes bought cheap after disaster. Their stories buried with the mines. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The dog stared toward the hallway. Walter heard it too. A soft sound, thump, from somewhere inside the house. Walter stood instantly and grabbed the flashlight. The hallway remained dark, except for moonlight leaking through cracked curtains. The thump echoed softly near the back bedroom. Walter moved carefully, one hand steady against the wall, breathing controlled. Ranger stayed beside him without a sound. Walter pushed the bedroom door open fast, empty, but the window above the old dresser hung partially open. Cold air drifted inside, carrying snowflakes with it. Walter crossed the room quickly. Fresh boot prints marked the snow outside beneath the window. Whoever entered the house earlier had come back, and they'd been inside, while Walter sat only 30 feet away. Ranger barked hard into the darkness beyond the yard. No answer came back. Only wind. Walter shut the window and locked it before searching the room carefully. That's when he noticed the dresser drawer sitting crooked. He pulled it open fully. Inside rested an old cigar box wrapped in cloth. Walter frowned. He was sure the drawer had been empty before. Ranger pressed close beside him while Walter opened the box carefully. Photographs. Old ones, mining crews, families standing beside trucks, children in heavy winter coats outside the Bitter Creek schoolhouse. Then Walter froze. One photograph showed several men beside a work truck near the Ridge Road sometime in the early 70s. One of them looked painfully familiar. Same narrow eyes, same jawline. Walter picked the photo up slowly. His father, much younger, but unmistakably his father, standing in Bitter Creek Valley, decades before Walter was born, and beside him stood Vernon Pike. Walter stared at the photograph until the edges trembled slightly in his hands. Ranger sat beside him near the fireplace, watching quietly. The younger version of his father looked thinner than Walter remembered. Hard eyes, cigarette between two fingers, snow piled behind the work truck, while Vernon Pike stood beside him, wearing the same heavy coat hanging upstairs in the farmhouse closet. Walter turned the photo over. Nothing written on the back. No date, no explanation. Just proof his father had once stood in this valley and never said a word about it afterward. The fire cracked softly beside him. Walter leaned back in the chair and rubbed both hands across his face. "You knew this place," he muttered toward the photo. "So why keep it buried?" Ranger rested his head against Walter's knee. The old shepherd always seemed to know when silence got too heavy. Outside, wind pushed snow against the farmhouse windows again. Walter barely slept. By morning, the sky hung low and gray over Bitter Creek Valley. The roads looked worse than usual, half buried beneath drifting snow. Walter drove into town anyway. He needed answers now. The diner smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee. A few ranchers sat along the counter, talking quietly beneath an old television mounted near the kitchen. Conversations slowed slightly when Walter entered with Ranger. Not hostile, just careful. Eli Turner sat near the back booth, drinking black coffee beside the window. The retired mechanic looked up as Walter approached. "You look like hell," Eli said. "Feel worse." Walter slid the photograph across the table. Eli studied it for several long seconds. Then he sighed. "Haven't seen Vernon in a long time. You knew my father too. Knew of him." Eli motioned toward the empty seat. "Sit down." Walter sat slowly while Ranger curled beneath the table. Snow drifted past the diner windows outside. "My dad never mentioned Bitter Creek," Walter said. "Most folks who left here didn't." "Why?" Eli stared into his coffee. "Because people carried guilt out of this valley same as they carried debt." Walter waited. Finally, Eli tapped the photo. "Your father worked maintenance crews during the mine years. Vernon did too. Back before the collapse." "The landslide?" Eli nodded slowly. "Tunnel supports started failing months before Miller's Ridge came down." His jaw tightened. Company kept production moving anyway. Walter felt cold settle deeper inside him. "How many died? Officially?" Eli shrugged. 5. "And unofficially?" Eli didn't answer right away. "That's where things get muddy." The waitress arrived with coffee refills. Nobody spoke until she walked away again. "My father involved somehow?" "No." Eli shook his head firmly. "Your old man wasn't management. Just another worker trying to feed his family." "Then why leave?" Eli looked toward the window. "Because after the collapse, folks started selling land cheap. Families moved away. Some blamed the company. Some blamed Vernon for pushing too hard, trying to expose what happened." Walter frowned. "Expose what?" "That the mine should been shut down weeks earlier." The diner suddenly felt warmer than before. Too warm. Walter loosened his coat slightly. "Vernon tried suing the company," Eli continued. "But lawsuits cost money. Witnesses disappeared. Records disappeared. Eventually most people just wanted to move on." Walter thought about the missing county files, the hidden papers underground, the break-in at the farmhouse. Somebody still cared enough to hide things decades later. "Did my father testify?" Eli hesitated. I don't know. That sounded honest, too. Ranger suddenly lifted his head beneath the table. A man had entered the diner. Owen Pike. The room shifted slightly when he walked in. Not fear exactly. More like discomfort people tried hiding behind normal conversation. Owen noticed Walter immediately, then the photograph on the table. For 1 second, his expression tightened, small but real. He approached slowly. Morning. Walter folded the photo back into his coat. You following me now? Owen ignored the question. You should leave the tunnels alone. Walter leaned back slightly. You keep saying that, because those mines killed enough people already. Eli snorted quietly into his coffee. Owen shot him a glance but continued talking to Walter. Vernon spent half his life digging through old records, trying to prove something nobody could fix anymore. And what exactly was that? Owen looked tired suddenly. Not angry, just worn down. That people in this valley made ugly choices when money got tight. He rubbed one hand across his jaw. You think that's rare? Walter stared at him. You benefited from it too. That landed hard enough to silence the booth. Finally, Owen nodded once. My father bought land after the collapse. Dirt cheap. He looked toward the snow outside. Most folks did, and Vernon hated him for it. Vernon hated everybody by the end. Ranger growled softly beneath the table. Owen glanced down at the dog. He doesn't trust me much. He's usually right about people. For the first time, Owen almost smiled. Then it vanished. Before leaving, he looked back toward Walter. If you keep digging around Tunnel C, bring supports. Walter frowned. You know where it is? Owen pulled his gloves on slowly. Everybody who worked the mines knew where it was. Then he walked back out into the snow. Later that afternoon, Walter returned underground. Ranger stayed close enough to brush his leg every few seconds. Tunnel B stretched cold and damp beneath the farm, while flashlight beams moved across old stone walls. Walter found the branching passage nearly 40 yards deeper than before. A faded marker still hung crooked overhead. Tunnel C. The wood supports looked worse here. Bent. Cracked. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. Walter moved slowly, testing the ground carefully. Ranger sniffed ahead nervously. Easy, boy. The tunnel narrowed sharply before opening into another chamber, half collapsed by time. Rotting beams leaned sideways over piles of dirt and broken rock. Walter spotted more filing crates near the far wall. He stepped carefully toward them. Then, everything shifted. A loud crack snapped overhead. Ranger barked violently. Walter turned just as one of the side supports splintered loose. A heavy timber dropped hard toward him. Ranger lunged. The old shepherd slammed against Walter's leg, knocking him sideways moments before the beam crashed into the dirt where he'd been standing. But Ranger cried out sharply. Walter's heart stopped. The dog stumbled backward, limping heavily now, favoring his front leg. Ranger. Walter dropped beside him immediately. The shepherd tried standing straight again despite the pain. Still protecting. Always protecting. Walter checked the leg carefully with shaking hands. No bone sticking through. Thank God. Probably bruised or strained. Still bad enough. You stubborn idiot, Walter whispered roughly. Ranger licked once at his glove. Walter sat there in the cold tunnel longer than he meant to, breathing hard, hand resting against the dog's thick fur. Years ago in Afghanistan, Walter had watched medics work on men bleeding into sand while helicopters thundered overhead. Funny thing about trauma, sometimes it waited years before finding the right crack to crawl through. Ranger whined softly when Walter helped him stand. That sound hurt worse than the falling beam. The drive to the veterinary clinic took nearly 40 minutes through worsening snow. Walter hated every mile. Not because of the roads, because of the cost. The small clinic smelled like antiseptic and wet coats. A tired veterinarian named Dr. Morales examined Ranger carefully, while Walter sat nearby gripping his hat too tightly. "Nothing broken," she finally said. "Soft tissue strain. He's lucky." Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Ranger wagged his tail weakly from the exam table. "Doctor." Morales smiled softly. "He's old, though. Recovery takes longer now." Walter nodded. He already knew that. At the counter afterward, he quietly counted crumpled bills from his coat pocket, while pretending not to notice how little money remained. Gas, food, dog medicine. Winter didn't care about pride. As Walter clipped Ranger's leash back on outside the clinic, snows began falling harder again across Bitter Creek. Ranger limped slightly beside him toward the truck. Then Claire Bennett's voice called from across the parking lot. "Walter." She hurried toward him holding several rolled maps under one arm. Her face looked pale beneath the falling snow. "I found something in the archive," she said breathlessly. Walter frowned. "What?" Claire unrolled one of the old mining maps carefully against the hood of the Chevy. Her finger pointed toward a section beneath the western ridge. "There's another chamber connected to Tunnel C," she whispered. Walter studied the faded lines. One section had been circled in red pencil decades earlier. "Sealed storage." Then Claire looked up at him. "The records say it was never reopened after the collapse." Snow hammered the farmhouse windows all night. By morning, the valley looked buried alive. Walter stood in the kitchen, staring at Claire's map spread across the table, while Ranger rested near the stove, with his injured leg stretched awkwardly beneath him. The old shepherd hated staying still. Every few minutes he tried standing again. "You're not coming," Walter muttered. Ranger ignored him immediately and limped toward the door anyway. Claire arrived just after sunrise wearing a heavy coat dusted white with snow. She carried a flashlight, 2 lanterns, and a thermos of coffee. "You sure about this?" she asked quietly. Walter looked toward the map. No, that honesty seemed to relax her more than confidence would have. The wind screamed across the valley while they crossed toward the grain shed through knee-deep snow. Ranger moved beside Walter, despite the limp, stubborn as ever. The tunnel entrance breathed cold air upward into the storm. Claire stared down the stairs uneasily. "I hate enclosed spaces," she admitted. Walter clipped a lantern onto his belt. Most sane people do. The deeper they descended, the quieter the world became. Soon, the storm above vanished completely behind dripping water and echoing footsteps. Tunnel C felt worse than before. The supports groaned constantly now. Moisture dripped through cracks overhead. Walter moved carefully, flashlight sweeping across old beams and unstable rock, while Claire followed close behind. Ranger stopped often to sniff the air. At one narrow passage, he suddenly froze. Walter stopped too. "What is it?" "Iss." The dog sniffed toward the darkness ahead and let out a low, uneasy sound. Not fear. Warning. Walter aimed the flashlight farther down the tunnel. The sealed chamber waited at the end of a collapsed side corridor, buried behind old timber and broken boards. Someone had once nailed heavy planks across the opening decades ago. Most had rotted away. Claire brushed snowmelt from her gloves nervously. "You think Vernon blocked this off?" Walter studied the boards. "No." He pointed toward the rusted warning sign barely hanging above the entrance. "Mining company did. Danger. Structural failure." The wood snapped loudly when Walter pried the remaining boards loose. Dust rolled out from the opening. Ranger barked once sharply. Then the smell hit them. Old paper, damp earth, gasoline maybe. Walter's pulse quickened slightly. The chamber beyond looked untouched. A small maintenance room carved directly into stone. Shelves lined the walls beneath years of dust. Filing boxes sat stacked beside a rusted desk lamp. Claire stared around slowly. My God. Walter stepped carefully inside. No treasure, no hidden money, just records. Dozens of them. Employee injury reports, property claims, unsigned compensation forms. Ranger moved slowly through the room, sniffing each corner while Walter opened the nearest filing box. Inside sat letters bundled carefully with string. He unfolded the first one. Mrs. Keller. We regret to inform you that due to liability restructuring, additional compensation claims related to the Miller's Ridge incident cannot be processed at this time. Walter grabbed another, and another. Every letter carried the same cold language. Delay, deny, disappear. Claire's eyes watered slightly as she flipped through another stack nearby. These people never got paid. Walter nodded slowly. Some files included medical expenses, funeral costs, photos of damaged homes. One folder contained names of workers injured weeks before the collapse. The company signatures at the bottom approved continued mining operations anyway. Walter felt anger building now. Not explosive anger, the colder kind, the kind that stayed. Ranger suddenly barked sharply near the back wall. Walter moved fast. The old shepherd stood beside a metal cabinet, half buried beneath debris. His ears stayed pinned forward. Walter pulled the cabinet open carefully. Inside rested dozens of sealed envelopes, handwritten, addressed to families around Bitter Creek. Claire picked one up gently. These were never mailed. Walter found Vernon Pike's name signed beneath several of them. He began reading one silently. I promised your husband I would not let them bury what happened here. Another mentioned children relocated after families lost their homes near the ridge. Another apologized for failing to stop the mine from reopening despite safety concerns. Claire wiped at her eyes quietly. He spent years trying to hold on to this. Walter nodded. Not greed, not paranoia. Vernon Pike had hidden the records because they were all that remained. Ranger suddenly growled. Low. Sharp. Walter looked up immediately. The dog stared toward the ceiling beams. Then Walter heard it hiss. Soft. Steady. Claire frowned. What's that sound? Walter's stomach dropped. Gas. Ranger barked violently now. Walter swept the flashlight upward. One of the old fuel lines running along the ceiling had cracked open near the wall. A thin stream hissed into the room. Move! Walter snapped. Claire froze for half a second. Then the lantern tipped. It hit the floor hard beside the desk. Glass shattered. Flame burst instantly across old paper and spilled fuel residue near the wall. The room ignited fast. Too fast. Claire screamed and stumbled backward while smoke exploded toward the ceiling. Walter grabbed her arm hard. Stay low. Ranger barked furiously near the doorway. The old shepherd already backed toward the tunnel entrance, limping but guiding them out. Smoke swallowed the chamber within seconds. Walter shoved Claire ahead, while heat rolled across the walls behind them. The tunnel groaned overhead. Wood supports cracked loudly, somewhere deeper inside. Ranger stopped twice to make sure they followed. Always checking, always waiting. By the time they reached the stairs, black smoke poured through the corridor behind them. Walter practically dragged Claire upward into the freezing daylight. They collapsed into snow beside the grain shed, coughing hard, while smoke drifted faintly from the tunnel below. The storm swallowed most of it immediately. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Only wind. Claire finally looked toward Walter with tears streaking down her face. They knew, she whispered hoarsely. The company knew people would die. Walter stared toward the buried valley beyond the farmhouse. Yeah. Ranger pressed against Walter's side. breathing hard from the climb. Walter rubbed both hands through the thick fur around the dog's neck. "You saved us again." The old shepherd's tail thumped weakly once against the snow. By late afternoon, the storm worsened. Walter boarded the tunnel entrance temporarily with scrap wood, while Claire organized the surviving papers inside the farmhouse. The kitchen table disappeared beneath stacks of files and letters. Outside, darkness settled early across Bitter Creek Valley. The house felt different now, heavier somehow, like the truth underground had finally climbed its way into the open air. Claire sat quietly near the fireplace, reading another letter, while Walter repaired the loose back door lock. "That company still exists in some form," she said softly. Walter glanced over. "How do you know?" "Some of the property transfers continued years after the mines shut down." She held up a document. "Different names, same legal office." Walter frowned. Before he could answer, Ranger stood suddenly near the front window, growling. Walter crossed the room fast. Headlights moved slowly outside the farmhouse, not passing by, stopping. A truck engine idled near the road. Then another light appeared farther back near the grain shed. Claire's voice dropped. "Walter." Ranger barked hard now. Walter stepped toward the front door carefully. The snow outside glowed pale beneath the truck headlights, and every lock on the farmhouse suddenly clicked open at once. Claire stepped backward from the kitchen table, so fast she nearly knocked over the lantern. Walter didn't move, not at first. His body had already gone somewhere older than thought, breathing slower, eyes tracking windows, shadows, distance to the back door. Ranger stood rigid beside him, growling low enough to vibrate through the floorboards. Then came the knock. 3 hard hits against the front door. Not frantic, controlled. Walter crossed the room slowly and opened it halfway. Snow whipped across the porch immediately. Owen Pike stood outside alone beneath the storm, collar pulled high against the wind. "You shouldn't have opened that room," he said quietly. Walter stared at him. "You picked a hell of a time for a visit." Owen glanced past him toward the papers scattered across the kitchen table. "I heard about the smoke near the grain shed. Funny how fast news travels around here." Owen ignored the jab. Behind him, another truck idled near the road. Walter couldn't see who sat inside. Claire appeared carefully near the hallway, but stayed silent. Ranger's growl deepened the second Owen stepped onto the porch. "I'm not here to fight you," Owen said. "Then why are you here?" Snow swirled between them. Finally, Owen exhaled heavily. "Because people in this valley are getting nervous." Walter almost laughed. "Nervous about old paperwork? Nervous about lawyers, reporters, state specters." Owen rubbed snow from his beard. "You start digging old graves open around here. Folks worry what crawls back out." Walter folded his arms. "Maybe it should." That hit harder than Owen expected. For a second, anger flashed across the man's face. Then it disappeared again beneath exhaustion. "You think this is simple?" Owen asked quietly. "My father bought land after the collapse because families needed money fast. So did half this valley. And the company got rich." Owen didn't deny it. "That mine shutting down killed Bitter Creek slow," he continued. "Jobs vanished, stores closed, people left." He pointed toward the storm outside. "You see this town surviving now? Barely." Walter glanced toward Claire. She looked pale but steady. "What exactly do you want from me?" Walter asked. Owen reached into his coat and placed another envelope onto the porch railing. Thicker this time. 40,000. Claire stared. Walter didn't touch it. "Take the money," Owen said. "Sell the farm. Burn the papers if you have to. Let dead people stay dead." Ranger barked sharply. Walter looked down briefly at the dog, then back toward Owen. You really believe that? The wind screamed harder through the valley. For the first time since Walter met him, Owen looked old, not dangerous, just tired. My father spent the last years of his life drowning in guilt, Owen said quietly. Vernon spent his drowning in anger. He shook his head slowly. Neither one changed what happened. Walter thought about the letters underground, the unpaid families, the names crossed out in red pencil. Maybe not, he said, but pretending it never happened sure as hell didn't fix it either. Silence settled heavily between them. Finally, Owen picked the envelope back up. You keep pushing this, he muttered. People in town won't forgive you. Then he turned and walked back into the storm. The trucks disappeared minutes later, but the unease stayed behind. Inside the farmhouse, Claire wrapped both hands around a coffee mug near the stove. They're scared, she whispered. Walter shut the front door carefully.
Yeah.
Are you? He didn't answer right away. Ranger limped toward the fireplace and lowered himself heavily onto the rug with a tired groan. Walter watched him for a long moment. Then finally, more tired than scared. The storm worsened overnight. Wind rattled the farmhouse hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Walter sat awake beside the dying fire while Ranger slept nearby, or tried to. The old shepherd kept twitching in his sleep. Dreaming, Walter understood that too well. Around 3 in the morning, a gust slammed something loose outside. Walter jerked upright instantly. For half a second the sound became artillery in his head. Metal screaming, voices over radios, the smell of diesel and smoke. His chest tightened hard. Ranger lifted his head immediately and pressed against Walter's leg before the panic could fully take hold. Grounding him, pulling him back, Walter rubbed a shaking hand across the dog's neck slowly. I'm all right, he whispered hoarsely. Lie. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the valley vanished beneath white darkness. By dawn, the storm eased enough for Walter to drive into town again. He needed air, needed distance from the farmhouse walls pressing inward around him. The hardware store buzzed quietly with locals buying salt, propane, and feed. Conversations lowered when Walter entered. Not openly hostile. Worse. Careful. A man near the register stopped talking entirely when Walter passed. Another glanced toward the newspaper rack, where old headlines about the Miller's Ridge collapse hung framed near the wall. Claire hadn't exaggerated. This valley carried memory like scar tissue. Walter bought dog food, lamp oil, and more lumber for boarding the tunnel entrance. As he loaded supplies into the Chevy, Eli Turner approached slowly from across the lot. You poked the hornet's nest good now, the old mechanic muttered. Walter shut the tailgate. Seems that way. Eli looked around carefully before lowering his voice. Folks around here don't want reporters sniffing through old graves. I haven't called anybody. Yet. Walter leaned against the truck. You think I should let it go? Eli stared toward the mountains surrounding Bitter Creek. Truth is, he sighed heavily, I don't know anymore. That answer felt more honest than certainty would. Before leaving, Eli glanced toward Ranger inside the truck. That dog trusts you completely. Walter followed his gaze. Ranger rested quietly on the bench seat, gray muzzle against the blanket Walter kept folded there. Sometimes I think he's smarter than me. Eli gave a tired smile. Most good dogs are. The drive back felt longer than usual. Snow covered nearly every fence line now. The valley looked buried under silence. Walter pulled into the farmhouse driveway just before dusk. Ranger climbed down slower than normal because of the injured leg. Walter waited for him, didn't rush him. That alone felt strange. A month ago, Walter barely cared what happened to himself tomorrow. Now he found himself checking Ranger's footing every few minutes, like it mattered more than breathing. Maybe it did. Inside the farmhouse, Walter sat alone at the kitchen table after dark, while Claire sorted more documents upstairs. The letters spread around him like ghosts. Families begging for help. Workers warning about unstable supports. Children relocated after losing homes. He stared at the $40,000 offer still sitting unopened near the stove. Enough money to disappear somewhere warmer. Enough to stop surviving one winter at a time. His eyes drifted toward Ranger, sleeping beside the fire. The old shepherd twitched once in his dreams. Walter rubbed both hands over his face slowly. "I'm too old for this," he muttered. Ranger opened one eye immediately, even half asleep, still listening. Walter let out a tired breath. Then suddenly the lights went out. The farmhouse dropped into darkness. Upstairs, Claire froze. Outside, an engine rumbled somewhere near the grain shed. Ranger surged to his feet, barking hard. Walter moved to the window instantly. A figure stood near the barn, holding a flashlight low against the snow, watching the house. Then the flashlight clicked off, and Ranger bolted into the storm. "Ranger!" Walter lunged for the front door before Claire could even react. Snow slammed sideways across the porch the second he stepped outside. Wind tore through Bitter Creek Valley, hard enough to steal breath straight from his lungs. The flashlight near the barn was gone. So was the figure. But Ranger's barking echoed faintly, somewhere beyond the grain shed. Walter grabbed the old coat hanging beside the door and pushed into the storm. Behind him, Claire shouted something he couldn't hear. The valley had become white chaos. Snow swirled thick beneath the dark sky. Fence posts vanished and reappeared like ghosts. Walter moved carefully across the yard, one hand shielding his eyes. "Ranger!" No answer. Only wind. Then another bark, farther away now. Walter's chest tightened instantly. The old dog shouldn't have been running through snow this deep. Not with the bad leg. Walter followed the tracks anyway. Fresh paw prints cut across the back field toward the tree line behind the farm. Human footprints crossed there too, half covered already. Whoever had been watching the house had gone into the woods. Walter kept moving. His knees ached with every step through the drifts. Cold bit through his boots fast, but he barely noticed anymore. All he could think about was losing the one thing still waiting for him every morning. Branches snapped somewhere ahead. Walt stopped instantly. Old reflex, listening, scanning. The storm carried strange tricks at night. Shadows became movement. Wind sounded like distant voices. Then came another bark. Weaker this time. Walter pushed harder uphill toward the forest edge. The beam from his flashlight finally caught Ranger near a cluster of fallen pines. The old shepherd stood beside a narrow drop hidden beneath snow and brush, barking once, then limping in circles anxiously. Walter hurried forward. "Easy, boy, easy." The ground gave slightly beneath his boots, not solid earth, wood. Walter lowered the flashlight carefully and saw weathered support beams buried beneath decades of snow and debris. A collapsed entrance. Another mining shaft. Ranger whined sharply and pawed at the edge. Then Walter heard it, not voices. Metal. A loose chain swinging slowly somewhere below. He crouched carefully beside the opening. The shaft wasn't deep, maybe 12 feet. Mostly filled with rockslide debris and old timber. And near the bottom sat a rusted iron marker, almost completely buried beneath snow. Walter slid down carefully. The cold down there felt different. Still, heavy. Ranger barked above him anxiously until Walter reached the marker and brushed snow away with gloved hands. Letters slowly appeared beneath the ice. Miller's Ridge Work Crew 1938 below that were names, dozens of them. some barely readable anymore. Walter stared silently. This wasn't official. No polished monument, no town memorial. Just rough, welded iron, hammered together by working men decades ago. A grave marker built by families who never got justice. Snow drifted softly into the collapsed shaft around him. Walter swallowed hard. Then he noticed smaller carvings near the bottom. Children's names, tiny initials beside them. His flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. All those letters underground. All those families erased quietly over time. And now this, not hidden by conspiracy, hidden by exhaustion. People died. Then people moved on because surviving demanded it. Walter suddenly understood Vernon Pike better than he ever had. The old man hadn't been protecting treasure. He'd been protecting memory. Ranger barked sharply again. Walter looked up. The shepherd had started slipping near the edge. Stay! Too late! Ranger lost footing on the ice and slid partway down the slope with a painful yelp. Walter caught him before he struck the rocks below. The impact slammed Walter backward against old beams, hard enough to knock air from his lungs. Pain burst across his shoulder instantly. Ranger whined against his chest. For one terrifying second, Walter thought the dog's injured leg had snapped completely. But Ranger slowly shifted again, still hurting, still alive. Walter pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's neck. "You stubborn old fool," he whispered shakily. Ranger licked once against Walter's frozen glove. Above them, wind screamed through broken trees. Walter looked again toward the memorial marker. Snow kept trying to bury it, just like the valley had buried everything else. He stood slowly with Ranger beside him and climbed carefully out of the shaft. By the time they reached the farmhouse again, Walter could barely feel his hands. Claire opened the door immediately. Oh my God. Snow covered both Walter and Ranger completely. Claire rushed to help while Walter guided the dog carefully inside near the stove. Ranger collapsed onto the rug, exhausted. Walter knelt beside him instantly, checking paws, breathing, leg. The old shepherd watched him quietly through tired eyes. "You should've let me freeze out there," Walter muttered softly. Ranger thumped his tail once. Claire handed Walter a towel. "What happened?" Walter sat heavily beside the fire. For a long moment he just stared into the flames. Then finally, "There's another shaft behind the ridge." Claire frowned. "Another tunnel?" "No." Walter shook his head slowly. "Something else." He told her about the memorial, the names, the children. Claire sat down quietly after that. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The storm outside slowly weakened toward dawn. Walter rubbed Ranger's ears gently while the dog rested his head across Walter's boot. "I spent years trying not to remember things," Walter said quietly. Claire looked toward him. "In Afghanistan, guys used to say forgetting was survival. Keep moving. Don't look back too long." He stared into the fire. But this place, he swallowed hard. This whole valley was built on forgetting. Claire nodded slowly. "And now?" Walter looked down at Ranger. The old shepherd had fallen asleep again despite the pain in his leg. Still close enough to touch. Still there. Walter realized something then. For weeks he'd kept pretending the farm was temporary, the tunnels temporary, the valley temporary. Like he could still leave before any of it mattered. But it already mattered. More than he wanted to admit. More than surviving another winter. He stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen table. The $40,000 offer still sat unopened beside the lantern. Walter stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up. Claire watched silently. Walter tossed the envelope directly into the fire. Flames swallowed it fast. Orange light flickered across the room, while snow drifted quietly outside the windows. Claire looked at him carefully. You sure? Walter watched the envelope burn down to black ash. No, he admitted. Then he glanced toward Ranger sleeping near the stove. But I know one thing. What is that? Walter looked toward the dark valley beyond the farmhouse windows. I'm not leaving Bitter Creek. Morning finally arrived, pale and cold. The storm had buried nearly everything beneath fresh snow. Walter stood outside beside the porch, holding an old cell phone in stiff, frozen hands. For several seconds, he just stared at the number written on Claire's scrap of paper. Local newspaper. Twin Falls Ledger. His thumb hovered over the call button. For years, Walter avoided people whenever possible. Crowds, questions, conversations. Silence felt safer. But down beneath Bitter Creek, entire families had vanished into silence already. And silence was exactly what buried them. Behind him, Ranger limped slowly onto the porch and sat beside Walter's boots. Waiting, Walter looked down at the old shepherd, then finally pressed call. The line rang 3 times before somebody answered. Twin Falls Ledger. Walter almost hung up. Old instinct. Disappear. Stay quiet. Keep moving. But Ranger stayed sitting beside him on the porch, snow collecting slowly across the dog's gray muzzle while dawn spread over Bitter Creek Valley. Walter swallowed once. My name's Walter Hayes, he said roughly. I think I found something people forgot. 3 days later, trucks rolled into Bitter Creek. Not police convoys, not federal agents, just reporters. Historians from the county office. A photographer from Boise. 2 retired miners who heard rumors and drove 3 hours through snow because they remembered the collapse from when they were kids. The valley changed after that. Slowly, painfully, the old records from the tunnels spread across folding tables inside the town hall. Families came looking for names. Some found fathers. Some found brothers. Some found proof that relatives had once existed at all. Claire helped catalog every document carefully. Walter mostly stayed near the back wall. Crowds still made him uneasy. Too many voices, too many doors closing, too many boots on wooden floors, but he stayed. Because every time he thought about walking out, Ranger would quietly settle beside his chair, like the dog already knew running wasn't an option anymore. One afternoon, Owen Pike finally entered the hall. Conversation stopped almost instantly. The tension in the room thickened. Walter watched him approach slowly through the crowd. Owen looked older now somehow. Smaller too, not weak, just tired. He carried a weathered cardboard box under one arm. My grandfather kept these, Owen said quietly. Nobody answered. Owen placed the box carefully onto the table beside the recovered tunnel records. Inside were photographs, letters, land agreements, old payroll sheets. Things his family had hidden for decades because admitting the truth would destroy everything they built afterward. My father told me not to open this box, Owen admitted. Said the valley survived because people stopped digging. Walter studied him silently. And what do you think? Owen glanced around the crowded hall. At the families, at the records, at the old memorial photographs leaning against the wall. I think surviving and living ain't always the same thing. Nobody clapped. Nobody forgave him instantly. That wasn't how real life worked. But people listened. And for the first time in decades, Bitter Creek stopped pretending nothing had happened. Winter slowly loosened its grip after that. Snow melted from rooftops first, then fields, then finally the roads leading out of the valley. Walter stayed through all of it. The farmhouse still leaked cold air through cracked boards. Half the barn leaned sideways. Some mornings the generator failed completely. But little by little, the place stopped feeling abandoned. Neighbors began showing up. One man brought lumber. Another fixed fencing. Claire organized volunteers from town to help clear debris near the old grain shed. Even Owen Pike returned twice with equipment to seal the dangerous shafts properly. Nobody trusted each other completely, but people kept coming back anyway. That mattered. One evening, Walter sat outside the farmhouse, watching Ranger sleep beneath the porch swing while sunset painted the valley gold. The old shepherd moved slower now. His hips stiffened in cold weather. Sometimes he struggled climbing stairs. Walter understood that feeling better than anyone. Claire stepped onto the porch carrying coffee. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. Walter stared across the fields. "For the first few weeks? Every day. And now?" Walter looked toward the barn where volunteers had started repairing part of the structure for temporary housing. A place for veterans passing through during winter. Nothing fancy, just heat, coffee, beds that locked from inside. Safe enough to breathe. He shook his head slowly. "No," he admitted. "I think I spent too long drifting already." Spring arrived late in Bitter Creek Valley. But when it finally came, green pushed through every place winter tried to kill. Grass returned first near the creek, then wildflowers along the fence lines. By May, children were running across fields that had sat silent for years. Walter watched most of it from the porch with Ranger beside him. The nightmares still came sometimes. Rotor blades, sandstorms, gunfire cracking through darkness. PTSD didn't vanish because life improved. That wasn't real. But now, when Walter woke in panic, he no longer woke alone in the back seat of a freezing Chevy. Now there was usually coffee brewing downstairs, wind moving through open fields, Ranger breathing steadily nearby, and sometimes voices, human voices. One afternoon, an old pickup truck rolled slowly into the driveway. Walter barely glanced up at first. Then the driver stepped out. A woman in her 40s, dark hair tied back against the wind. Walter froze instantly. Marcy. His daughter looked uncertain, standing beside the truck door, like somebody arriving at a stranger's house. A little boy climbed out beside her, holding a toy tractor in one hand. Walter couldn't speak for several seconds. Marcy walked forward slowly. "I heard about the farm," she said quietly. "Saw the article online." Walter nodded once. Neither of them knew what to say next. Years sat between them, missed birthdays, ignored calls. Long stretches of silence, too heavy to explain in one conversation. Then Ranger slowly rose from the porch. The old shepherd limped across the yard straight toward Marcy. Her face softened instantly. "Oh my God," she whispered, kneeling down. "Ranger." The dog pressed gently against her chest while the little boy laughed nervously nearby. "He remembers you," the boy said. Walter finally found his voice. "He remembers everybody." Marcy looked up at her father then, really looked at him. The tired eyes, the repaired porch, the people working near the barn in the distance. "You built all this?" Walter shook his head. "No," he said honestly. "People helped." The little boy approached carefully. "You the soldier, Grandpa?" Walter almost smiled at that. "Used to be." The child pointed toward Ranger. "He yours?" Walter looked down at the old shepherd standing faithfully beside his leg. For a long moment he couldn't answer, because the truth felt bigger now than ownership. Finally, he nodded once. "Yeah," he said softly, "he's mine." Summer arrived gently over Bitter Creek Valley. The memorial near Miller's Ridge became permanent at last. Families gathered there one morning beneath clear blue sky while names lost for decades were read aloud again. Not erased anymore, not forgotten. Walter stood near the back with Ranger resting against his boot while wind rolled through the grass. No speeches about heroes, no dramatic ending, just people finally telling the truth out loud. Later that evening, Walter sat alone on the porch, watching sunset settle across the valley. Ranger slowly walked out into the open field, one last time before dark. The old shepherd moved carefully through tall grass glowing gold beneath the fading light, still checking the fence lines, still watching over the place. Walter leaned back in the chair quietly. For years he'd believed survival meant shutting the world out before it could hurt you again. But loneliness had nearly buried him deeper than any tunnel beneath Bitter Creek. Ranger stopped halfway across the field and looked back toward the porch, toward home. Walter smiled faintly, and for the first time in a very long while, he fell asleep without waking in fear. Maybe that was the real secret hidden beneath Bitter Creek all along. Not money, not buried treasure, not revenge. Just the reminder that people can survive terrible things and still find a way back to each other. Walter spent years believing his life was already over. He lost his home, his family, his sense of purpose. Little by little, he stopped expecting kindness from the world. But one old dog never gave up on him. Ranger stayed beside him through the cold nights, the panic attacks, the storms. And every moment, Walter wanted to disappear from the world completely. And sometimes that's how healing really begins. Not through grand speeches, not through miracles, just one loyal soul refusing to leave you behind. This story may be dramatized, but the struggles behind it are very real for many veterans, lonely people, and those carrying wounds nobody else can see. Maybe the lesson is simple. The people society forgets are often the ones who need compassion the most, and sometimes the smallest act of loyalty can save a life. So before you go, I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you think Walter saved Ranger? Or did Ranger save Walter? Type 1 for Walter. Type 2 for Ranger. And if stories like this mean something to you, you're always welcome here. Subscribe for more quiet stories about loyalty, second chances, and the people the world too often overlooks. Until next time, take care of yourself and don't leave the good souls behind.